Welcome to the Boomer Briefing Podcast, where we help you solve a critical business issue in 20 minutes or less. I'm your host, Jon Hubbard, shareholder and consultant here at Boomer Consulting. And with me today is Marc Staut. Marc, thank you for being on this episode of the podcast.
Thanks very much for having me back again, Jon.
Always a pleasure, Marc. Marc is our Chief Innovation and Technology Officer. And our topic for discussion today is keys around IT governance. And I think you have 4 keys that you're going to share with our audience today. But let's start for those that maybe aren't even familiar with that term so much, right? Let's start with, what is IT governance from your perspective, Marc?
Yeah, governance is really about making the proper decisions. It's making decisions that are going to define your requirements. It's going to set your expectations. It may be granting authority or responsibility, but it's also about how we're going to set measures for performance as well. So it's really, how do we run things? How are we going to make sure that the things that we're working on are the proper things? And that always comes down to alignment between the IT or the technology vision and the firm's strategic vision.
That's great. And I wanted to ask you that question to start, because that's a really compelling answer. The word governance doesn't always, make people excited, but really what you hit on there is aligning that IT vision and strategy with the firm vision and strategy. They need to be in lockstep. And if your governance structure doesn't put that at the forefront, then there's probably some opportunity there. So let's talk about that. You work with firms of all sizes in multiple areas, one of which is helping them stand up their IT governance structures, but also maintain, manage all those good things. You serve on, firms' boards and all of that. You've seen a lot. Tell us about some of the ways firms can go about creating an IT governance structure that works for them.
Yeah, it goes by a whole bunch of different names. Every firm seems to have a slightly different name for it, but most often we hear it referred to as an IT steering committee. And that is a group of people that is cross-functional, meaning it's not just a bunch of the IT people, and it's people from all different levels that are going to take a look at the things that are going on and really say, hey, are these our top priorities? Are these the things that need to be happening? Are these initiatives going to drive our firm into the strategic future that we really envision and that we see for it? Something to be really cognizant of. It's not about approving things for IT. So IT doesn't come up with, hey, here's my project, may I please do this? It's really about working together with the technology leaders and the business leaders to make sure that you're driving things in the right direction. So often we hear about the fact that, IT projects are oftentimes some of the most expensive projects that firms do. And that's where a lot of the money is going. Right after talent, it's usually towards technology. So making sure that you're not just working hard, but that you're working on the right things at the right time, and that you're really driving towards business goals is the primary objective.
Is there a common size for an IT steering committee? I mean, it's probably influenced by the firm size, but you probably get into selection on who should be a part of that. Any thoughts or insight there?
Oh, that's a great question, Jon, and one that we haven't talked about, you and I, before, but is spot on. It's one of the biggest challenges that firms have, because too many times they have too many people. Everybody who's got any type of firm leadership role ends up on the IT steering committee, and then you're sitting there with 15, maybe even 18 or 20 people sitting around, and it's very difficult to get anything accomplished. Your ideal size is much more going to be 8 to 12 people that are representative of the different areas in the firm. So you may have somebody who is representing the advisory service lines, but you don't have to have someone from each and every advisory service line, for example. Other key people that you want involved, you're going to want some of your operational folks there. because they understand how the firm works and what is happening to get business out the door. And you're usually going to have representation from your primary areas, whether that's assurance or tax as well.
So I mentioned in kind of the setup of the question of you actually being on some firms' IT steering committees, whether that's for a short time or a longer period of time. When should a firm that has a IT steering committee consider, hey, should we have an outside perspective in this? Should they have that be a part of their regularly occurring meetings? Is it a few times a year? Any tips around that?
Absolutely. I think they should do that right from the very start. And it doesn't have to be us at Boomer Consulting. It doesn't have to be another consultant. It can be another well-respected member of another firm that you admire what they're doing. So we often see CIOs will sit on each other's IT steering committees. And the reason for that is that outside perspective to say, hey, here's what's really happening in the marketplace. Here's what we're seeing. There's a lot of weight that happens with that. It becomes easier for the outside person to say, yeah, that's a pet project, or that's something that you're clearly very passionate about, but is that really something that is going to drive the firm forward? And so they can take that role of what I like to call the speaker of hard truths, and challenge some of the ideas, but they also have a different perspective and they're not caught in the same echo chambers.
That's great. Have you seen IT steering committees bring in clients or the perspective of clients, or how
I
does
have
that
not.
typically?
Yeah, I haven't seen that on the IT steering committee, though. If you're looking for a way to involve and elevate the client experience, then doing some surveys around that would be really, really helpful. So for specifically sticking to technology, survey your clients about what technology they're looking for. What would you like to see from the firm? Is it a digital portal? Is it a no-touch type of tax return? Is it furthering digital signatures? Is it more touch points and further conversation? Is it in business intelligence and dashboards? It could be a whole lot of different things. So asking your clients is absolutely critical. And then take that information back to the IT steering committee and say, okay, here's what our clients are asking for. How does this line up with our firm strategic objectives and our technology strategic roadmap?
Perfect. That's great advice, Mark. Okay, so for the firms that have an IT steering committee or that IT governance structure set up, and maybe they've had it in place for a year or two, or maybe even more, what are some of the success stories or some of the benefits or some of the results you've seen those firms be able to experience that maybe they wouldn't have otherwise gotten to experience if they didn't have that set up?
Yeah, I think that it's really important that they tend to have a different perspective, because you have this cross-functional team, because you are all in alignment towards a strategic vision. Then you're really looking at the enterprise as a whole, and you're saying, how do we move this forward? So you have less individual voices, sometimes that may or may not have the best ideas, or that may or may not have the most influence, but that they're much more focused on what is going to be the holistic best solution for the firm. We also want to be focused a little bit. Again, I mentioned before, it's not really where you come to approve or disapprove projects, but really to vet the concepts that are there. So less of the how are we going to do things, and more of the what are we going to do, because there are so many different opportunities for technology to improve efficiency and effectiveness throughout the firm. That's one of the areas that we should really be focused on. And then, of course, there's an opportunity for leadership as well. So an interaction between your technology leadership and your business leadership is going to make for an incredibly strong partnership. And those are the firms that we see really thriving the most.
Yeah. So you mentioned the firm or the term approval a couple times.
Yeah.
Is the approval for those types of projects usually happening at the partner level? So the steering committee makes a recommendation to the partner group and then ultimately they vote, or can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. The steering committee should be making recommendations. They should be looking at all the different pieces that are there. Again, not necessarily the how, but what is it that we should be doing? Then that goes up to either an executive committee, an operations committee, the partner group, depends on the structure of the firm and the size, frankly, of the firm. But usually that recommendation is what the IT steering can be most impactful for.
Yes. Okay. Awesome. Thanks for the clarity. I've never served on an IT steering committee, as you can probably imagine. So I have a lot of, questions around this, but that's really good advice. Um, one thing we always do on this podcast, and for our listeners, we always do this. We always ask, how is the topic related to outside the profession? Is there any bullet points, any insight, any perspectives from outside the walls of the accounting profession that are worth noting to maybe influence our decision on whether we need to pursue this in our firm or anything like that? Mark, as you think about what happens outside the accounting profession, which you pay a lot of attention to, what are some considerations we should have inside of it?
Yeah, outside of our profession, there are so many more integrations with technology and the business. It's something that is kind of taken for granted in other industries. So, being able to work closely and think of technology as having a strategic seat at the table and being part of driving the business forward is really, really critical, because if you think about it and you get all of the different types of firm leadership together, you have some just amazing business leaders, business minds, that are able to bounce ideas off of each other, to challenge each other, to ask the right types of questions, to envision a bigger future. Then you add in, your operational aspects, your marketing and sales, your human resources, add in project management, your budgeting, your cash flow, and this is where the magic really happens. But if your technology isn't part of those conversations, you're missing a large opportunity to have them included, because so much of a business is run off of our technology platforms now. It's really hard to imagine how we would do much of anything without the technology. So not including it as a strategic asset that should be leaned on and taken into account in a holistic way is really a mistake that a lot of firms tend to still be making. Not every firm, for sure. There are definitely some really good, innovative firms that are driving their technology, and it's becoming a competitive advantage for them. But outside of the CPA profession, technology is way more integrated with the business.
Yep. So, firm leaders, we got to pay attention to what Mark just said there, because we do not want to be behind the curve, right? And our profession is not always known as being ahead of the curve on a lot of these topics. And so, I've heard you speak on that before, and that still rings true today. So, as we round out our conversation here, Mark, what's the next step someone should take? Maybe they're driving into the office, maybe they're on lunch listening to this podcast, and they're thinking, you know what, I've heard this term before. I know maybe some other firms that have something like this stood up. What's the first step they should take?
Yeah, I think the very first thing to do, no matter what the name of it is, if you've got a group or a team that is trying to drive that technology governance, that IT governance committee, IT steering committee, whatever it may look like, ask if it's really doing what you intended for it to do. These things tend to get away from us pretty quickly, and sometimes they devolve into a lot less effective groups than you would really hope for. They start out really strong, but then people get promoted, they get busy, they get pulled into other projects, and you are constantly needing to reevaluate the effectiveness. And that goes for both the mission and the vision of the IT steering committee, but also the membership of the IT steering committee. So take a look at what you've got and how you are governing your technology in your firm. And if it's not up to the highest strategic standards of alignment with your business, then take a step back and say, okay, well, how can we reinvent that? That may be giving us a call, and talking through some of the options of what this would look like. Frequently, I just give some advice to firms about, hey, here are some things that we would recommend. And good starting points for rethinking how you're leveraging a governance committee.
That's great. So, Marc, if someone did want to reach out to you, what are some various ways they could contact you?
Yeah, LinkedIn is always a good one. And then we've, of course, got our Boomer website, boomer.com. You can find all of our contact information there. You can also ask for some of our solution specialists to set up a time for us to chat about this further.
Awesome. Well, Marc, as always, thank you for being on this episode of the podcast. And for our listeners, we release new episodes every Tuesday morning. So if you have not subscribed yet, please go ahead and do that. Each week, we rotate topics around leadership, technology, process, talent, and growth. But one common theme is these topics we discuss here are always critical to your firm's success. So thanks for listening and stay tuned for the next episode. Thanks so much.